In December 1953, one of the most well-attested UFO sightings in history took place. It was witnessed by several highly trained observers from two different vantage points. The witnesses were personnel from the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation and included Clarence Kelly Johnson, the first team leader of Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, who played a leading role in the design of over 40 aircraft, including several honored with the prestigious Collier Trophy, acquiring a reputation as one of the most talented and prolific aircraft design engineers in the history of aviation. Lockheed have long been rumored to be in possession of alien technology, and that rumor has resurfaced recently due to the whistleblower David Grush's allegations that the U.S. and private aerospace companies have recovered non-human-made vehicles and are actively attempting to reverse engineer them. The sighting took place very near to the Channel Islands off the coast of California, where many UFO sightings have taken place throughout the last few decades. In light of these facts, this carefully documented sighting is fascinating to examine in detail. Let's take a look at the reports from the witnesses. This bundle of reports comes from the file of Ben Rich and is titled, Sighting of a Flying Saucer, by certain Lockheed Aircraft Corporation personnel, on December 16, 1953. The first report, by Clarence Kelly Johnson, is as follows.
December 18, 1953. To Air Force Investigating Group on Flying Saucers. On Wednesday, December 16, 1953, my wife and I went out to our ranch, which is 3 miles west of Agoura, California, and 1 mile north of Ventura Boulevard. We arrived there at about sundown, which is close to 4:45 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We went immediately to our ranch house, which is located on a hill facing southwest. At approximately 5 o'clock, within 2 minutes accuracy, I was looking at the sunset through a large plate glass window, when I noticed above a mountain to the west what I first thought to be a black cloud. The sun had gone down and the whole western sky was golden red, with several thin layers of clouds were haze at fairly high altitude. I wondered why this one object was so dark, considering that the sun was behind it. I immediately thought that some aircraft had made an intense smoke trail, so I studied the object closely. It was apparent, after my first few seconds of consideration, that the outline of this object did not change. Thinking it was a lenticular cloud, I continued to study it, but it did not move at all for 3 minutes. I do not know how long it was there before my attention was called to it. When it did not move or disintegrate, I asked my wife to get me our 8-power binoculars so I would not have to take my eyes off the object, which by now I had recognized as a so-called saucer. As soon as I was given the glasses, I ran outside and started to focus the glasses on the object, which now was moving fast on a heading between 240 degrees and 260 degrees. When I got the glasses focused on the object, it was already moving behind the first layer of haze. I gathered its speed was very high, because of the rate of foreshortening of its major axis. The object, even in the glasses, appeared black and distinct, but I could make out no detail, as I was looking toward the setting sun, which was, of course, below the horizon at this time. In 90 seconds from the time it started to move, the object had completely disappeared, in a long shallow climb on the heading noted. The clouds were coming on shore, in a direction of travel opposite to that of the object. The time in which my wife and I studied this object was between 5 o'clock and 5:05. The object, which had hovered stationary for at least 3 minutes, appeared to be very large, but, not knowing its distance from me, I could not estimate its dimensions. At all times the object appeared as an ellipse, with a fineness ratio of the larger axis to the minor one of about 7 or 10 to 1. I estimated the position of the object to be roughly over Point Magoo, which lies on a bearing about 255 degrees from my ranch.
On Wednesday, December 16, 1953, I participated in a test flight of a Navy Super Constellation WV-2, taking off at 4:29 p.m. The flight crew consisted of Roy Wimmer, pilot, myself, co-pilot, Charlie Grugan, flight engineer, and Joe Ware, flight test engineer. We climbed out towards the ocean and leveled off at 10,000 feet for a short test. After completing this test somewhere around 14,000 feet, avoided a couple of small clouds, and continued to climb towards 20,000 feet. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 feet, Roy Wimmer said to me, "Look out, there's a flying saucer." I looked out the windshield towards where Roy was pointing and saw some sort of an object at approximately the altitude that we were flying. I made a slight turn heading right towards this object, expecting to overtake it so that we could look at it more closely. I maintained this heading for roughly 5 minutes, looking at the object all the time. Wimmer, Ware and myself viewed this thing for at least 5 minutes, discussing what we thought it might be. Wimmer's first impression was that it was a small cloud. After studying it for several minutes though, I deduced that it was not a cloud because it had 2 definite sharp edges and its appearance stayed constant. It looked to me like I was flying right directly towards, and at about the same elevation as, a very large flying wing airplane. I would estimate at this time that I was somewhere between 17,000 and 18,000 feet. Although the object appeared to be absolutely stationary, we did not seem to be closing the gap between us and this object, even though we were flying at some 225 miles per hour. The object then seemed to be getting smaller, and any attention was diverted from it for a minute or so, but Wimmer mentioned that the object was disappearing. In probably an elapsed time of somewhere around a minute, the object had reduced in size to a mere speck, and then disappeared. Its direction was almost due west. At the time, the sun had gone below the horizon but the sky was red, and this object had been silhouetted perfectly against this red background. The atmosphere was extremely clear. When I first sighted this object, I guessed that it was probably 7 miles away. However, looking at it in retrospect, the object must have been considerably larger than I had estimated and, hence, the distance was probably much greater than I had also estimated. Looking back at the flight record taken on this flight, it was recorded that we leveled off at 20,000 feet at 5.10. Inasmuch as we had sighted this object when we were somewhere between 16,000 and 18,000 feet, our view of the object started at roughly 5 o'clock, or just a little before that. We continued with our test flight, thinking no more of this observation, and landed after 6 o'clock. We discussed other details of the flight and then went home. When I got home, I described the so-called flying saucer to my family and made a little sketch of what it looked like to me. This morning, I reported to work and went directly to see Mr. C.L. Johnson, Chief Engineer, to give him a report on activities occurring in the last few days, inasmuch as he had just returned from a trip. In attendance at this meeting were also Mr. Jack Wassall and Mr. Carl Hatton. We discussed a number of things and, in the course of the conversation, I discussed the flight made yesterday on the WV-2. Upon completion of the technical discussion, I casually mentioned, for fear of being ridiculed, that I had been chasing a flying saucer last night. Kelly snapped this up immediately, and said that he knew exactly where it was and when, and, with no further ado, he said that it was at 5.05 and the object was sighted off Point Magoo. This literally bowled me over, because the location of the object that I sighted was off of Point Magoo. I had estimated that it was somewhere between Point Magoo and the Santa Barbara Islands. Incidentally, at the time I had sighted it, we were flying over the ocean just off of Long Beach. Kelly then related that last night at about 5:05 p.m. he had seen an object in the western sky and had gotten his binoculars and looked at it in detail. He described it as a wing with aspect ratio of approximately 7. He said that it appeared stationary for several minutes, and then heading directly west it disappeared in 1 to 2 minutes, as I recollect his conversation. This story jibes exactly with what we saw in flight at the same time. I might mention that I have been very skeptical of flying saucer stories, and have never even imagined seeing an object in the sky that I was not able to identify. The 3 who watched it from the airplane are all pilots who have been flying for many years on experimental test work, and are trained to make accurate observations. Kelly also had had a lot of experience in flight test work, and has been flying for many years and is also a very trained observer. The fact that what he saw and what we saw appears to be identical, and the time and place identical, leads me to believe that it was not exactly an illusion that I observed. Signed, R. L. Thoren, Chief Flight Test Engineer.
On Wednesday, December 16, I made a test flight in Constellation 4501. The crew in the cockpit consisted of myself as pilot, R. L. Thoren as co-pilot, Charles Grugan, flight engineer, and J.F. Ware as flight test engineer. I took off late in the afternoon and ran some tests during the climb to 10,000 feet and then made a level run for a few minutes. I then started to climb to 20,000 feet and turned the controls over to Rudy Thoren. We continued our climb in a southeasterly direction, and somewhere in the vicinity of Long Beach or Santa Ana between 15,000 and 20,000 feet we made a right turn onto a west heading. The sun had just set, but the air was very clear and the light real good toward the west. I noticed a cloud layer in the west starting somewhere east of Santa Cruz Island at about our altitude. Above this cloud layer, well out in the clear air, I saw what I thought was a small cloud. Just for the fun of it I said, "Hey, look at the flying saucer." After watching it for a few minutes we decided it wasn't a cloud but some kind of object. It had a definite shape which appeared to me like a crescent. Others on board described it as a huge flying wing. I could not detect any details other than the shape of it. I estimated the distance from us to be at least 50 or 60 miles and possibly much farther. In the clear air like that it is very hard to judge distance. We flew directly toward it for about 5 minutes and our relative position did not appear to change. I do not recall our exact speed, whether we were still climbing or whether we had leveled off during this time. As Rudy was flying the airplane, I had nothing else to do but to watch the object. After about 5 minutes I suddenly realized it was moving away from us heading straight west. In the space of about 1 minute it grew smaller and disappeared. I was watching it all the time, so I was able to see it for several seconds after the rest of the crew had lost sight of it. Right up until the time it disappeared it maintained its sharp outline and definite shape, so I know it was not a cloud that dissolved giving the appearance of moving away. I might add that I've had considerable experience, while doing radar bombing on P2Vs, of estimating distance where there is very little to judge by, and I am convinced this was a large object some distance away. Signed, Roy Wimmer, Engineering Test Pilot.
This is an account of my experience of witnessing the presence of an object in the sky. I was flying in the Lockheed WV-2 airplane with Mr. R.L. Thoren, Mr. Joseph Ware, Mr. Roy Wimmer, plus other members of the flight test group. The 3 individuals mentioned and I were in the pilot's compartment of the airplane. At approximately 5 p.m. on the night of Wednesday, December 16, 1953, while flying off the coast in the vicinity of Santa Monica, I saw an object apparently standing still in the air off the coast, in the vicinity of Point Mugu. We were flying at 16,000 feet, and to the best of my judgment the object was at the same altitude. The object appeared as a thin black line, giving a first reaction of a B-36 type airplane, heading straight toward us and silhouetted against a bright background. The background was bright due to the fact that the sun was just setting. The object appeared not to move while we progressed with our tests. For a few moments we turned the airplane toward the object but did not apparently change our distance sufficiently to get any change of impression. I estimate that the object was hovering in our sight for about 10 minutes. Thereafter, it suddenly accelerated due west and in a time, in the order of 10 seconds, disappeared from view. The following day it was revealed that Mr. Clarence L. Johnson had seen the identical object while standing on the ground at his ranch. This coincidence is interesting. The difference in the positions, both horizontally and vertically between us, indicate that the object had sufficient depth to eliminate the possibility that it was a cloud phenomenon. The similarity of the explanations of the shape and actions of the object is remarkable. However, the blackness made it impossible to discern anything but the basic outline. Signed, P. Coleman, Chief Aerodynamic Engineer.
On December 16, 1953, I was aboard WV-2 airplane LAC 4301 with Roy Wimmer as pilot, Rudy Thoren as co-pilot, Charlie Grugan as flight engineer. Phil Coleman was also in the cockpit. At about 5 p.m. we were over the Catalina Channel area, between Avalon and Palos Verdes Hill, at 15,000 to 16,000 feet, on top of a scad to broken overcast. The horizon, well defined by the rays of the setting sun, and sky above the overcast, was clear. Our attention was drawn to what looked like a large airplane off to the right. We were roughly paralleling the coast at the time, and Roy, I think, mentioned, "There's a flying saucer." We have kidded Roy a good deal about flying saucers since the night about 2 years ago, when he and Bob Laird were in 1961's, and sighted some lights over Catalina. These lights reportedly stood still for a while and moved around over the island and finally disappeared. I was standing between the pilots and observed the object out the co-pilot's window in 4301. Phil Coleman's attention was also drawn to the object. Rudy, who was flying at the time, turned around and headed toward the object. During this time, it seemed to be stationary, although we did not appear to overtake it at all. My first thought was that it was possibly a C-124, but after looking more closely, it seemed to look more like a large object without wings with a maximum thickness in the middle tapering toward either side. I could not distinguish front or rear on the object. It seemed to be somewhat above us and to the west, over the water, possibly in the vicinity of Santa Barbara Islands. After looking at the object off and on for about 5 minutes, it became apparent that it was moving away from us, and in just a minute or two it completely disappeared. It disappeared in a generally westward direction, toward the setting sun. I've been interested in flying saucers, particularly ever since one evening during the 1951 Christmas holidays. I was putting up a TV antenna on my roof when looked up toward the north over the hills behind our home and saw a large circular object, apparently stationary. The time of day was about dusk, and I watched the object for several minutes and called Leslie and a neighbor, Mr. Murphy, who also looked at it. There is a small airstrip at Giant Rock, and I have visited the group of people there who have devoted their life to flying saucers. They have many photographs and books on the subject, and figuratively eat and sleep saucers. Signed, J.F. Ware, Jr., Section Supervisor, Flight Test.
So, we have multiple trained observers from different vantage points, all reporting the same thing, all of them discounting the idea that the giant object was a cloud, aircraft, or some sort of illusion. Pilots have long reported UFOs over the ocean, from the 1940s right up until the present day. Can these objects be of the same origin as the ones involved in the 2004 Nimitz Tic Tac encounter, which took place around the same area? Could this sighting have influenced Lockheed's potential subsequent involvement in the recovery and reverse engineering of alien craft? We hope to find out as the truth continues to slowly leak from the secret world of special access programs now being exposed by whistleblowers like David Grush. Until next time, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching.